Hey, everybody. Please go ahead and add your name to the agenda list of attendees. I just pasted the link to the agenda in the chat.
Yeah, there's some future items on that agenda. Make sure you enter it on the right date.
That's a good point. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so Dan, I'm living on the edge right now. The power's back on for the minute, and I decided to switch over to use Wi-Fi. So if the power goes out and you lose me, I should be back in about like 15, 30 seconds, however long it takes me to switch over to use my phone to be tethered. I don't know what's going on.
Oh, geez, the hurricane's there already, huh?
It's actually a gorgeous day outside. It looks beautiful here, so no, we're not supposed to get anything for a while.
Hi, this is Angel. I'm in Florida, so I'm actually about to get hit.
Oh, geez. So if you disappear from the call, we'll know why.
Yeah.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
Good morning.
Doug, do you want to share the agenda while we're waiting, or should I, in case you lose connection?
Yeah, yeah. Hold on a minute.
Here, I'll post it to the chat. Here you go.
Yeah, I really wish Slack. I'm sorry, not Slack. Zoom showed the chat history.
You're asking for too much from these tools.
I know. Sorry. Let's see. Okay, can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay. Not the very long agenda. It's basically going to review the action items from last week. And actually, in fact, Dan, I may ask you to share. That way you can sort of drive the changes that you've made so we can talk about them.
Okay. Can I just share over you, or does you have to drop sharing?
That's a good question. Let me
Yeah,
stop sharing.
you have to stop sharing before someone else could share.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, hopefully this works.
All right, let's see who's on. We have, do we have Ken on?
Not yet. I reached out to him this morning because I need him for something else, but he's been unresponsive.
Okay. Dan, you may want to make your font a little bit bigger. For those of us who are old and don't have big screens.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, good enough. Thank you.
Yeah, my cat woke up, so of course got some background music here.
At least it's not quite as loud as a dog barking. So.
Nice. Okay, so we've got the agenda here. I don't know when you want to get started.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. 4 is after good enough. So go ahead and like I said, on the agenda we just have 2 things. One, I want to have Dan walk through the changes that he's made so far, and then Chris, if you're on, maybe we could talk about Chris's status on his write-up, or the difference between serverless and functions as a service. But go ahead and start, Dan. Walk us through the changes that you've made and see what people think.
Sure. So last week we got feedback from Chris Munns from Amazon that we wanted to soften the language on containers, right? It's kind of an implementation detail. And if the point of view of the developer is serverless, it really doesn't need to be at the forefront. We kept it there, of course, because the Cloud Native Computing Foundation does focus on the spectrum of the developer, the operator, and another focus obviously has the legacy of Kubernetes being a core part of the projects that are governed there. So
Dan, are you looking at the doc right now, or are you back on the agenda?
I'm on the agenda right here.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll switch over to it in a second.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was the that was the context behind the changes I made. And then there was Chris Munns had those comments too. So I tried to integrate what I known based on his we co-presented at a conference a couple weeks back. So I had his perspective already, and I included that, not deeply, but enough hopefully to include his concerns. Okay, so now I'm over at the white paper. How's that font?
That looks good, thank you.
Okay, so the abstract, I just spaced it out so it was easier to see some of the concepts in here. So this was one of the first things I did was ensure that we did address this idea of a serverless provider versus a functions as a service engine, which was a core concern. And also that positioning versus infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. I did add a piece here on, that one of the outcomes we do want is a set of recommendations. The wording here I'm not happy with, but that's here. And also that we talked a bit more about the target end user of this paper. What I found is with serverless, you can quickly start to mix your audiences, particularly when you're coming from the legacy of having built an open source platform for this. You've got the end user who's your consumer of the serverless service, and then you have other folks that are interested in operating or installing that system themselves in order to provide it to end users. So hopefully we address up front that end user is the key point of view we're looking at, but that there is a tie back to those open source functions as a service engines, and the interest overlaps with Kubernetes. So that's the general piece here. So there was a lot of comments in line about how to update this upfront section on what serverless is, that we had a lot of references to containers. And as I was going through those comments, and also just the general organization of this paper, it occurred to me that perhaps why don't we just leave that container references out up front, right? So you'll see later in the doc, I struck out those areas, but I left them in the doc. And what I did was I brought up, instead, because we have that end user focus, the workloads from, it used to be Appendix A, and I pulled that into this main section so that you get this idea of this is serverless, this is how it differs from FAS and BAS, and that these are the workloads where it really is promising. So we start up front with that, and then we work more.
Hold on a minute, Dan. Dan, hold on just a sec. So
sure.
Let's take a quick pause. So Dan's talked a little bit about the abstract, and then that first section and moving the workloads up. Does anybody have any comments on that? Any concerns? Does it sound like a good approach? And I know you guys aren't that shy. Don't make me pick on people. Okay, I'm going to pick on somebody I know who has the opinion. Yaron, do you have an opinion on that? Yaron, are you there?
Yeah, I need to see the details, but I think in general it's a good idea to talk about the use cases. I think the only thing is that some people may say, yeah, the same use cases can be implemented in other technologies as well.
Right. Yeah. And so I think we addressed that. Somebody else had actually a nice little section up front in this first area. So let me hop over to it. And I think the reason it's done is number one, yes, we do have a nice comparison there already that somebody added. We do have the FAS versus BAS, and then we work into the use cases where we describe why those are a good fit for serverless versus other implementations. So I think it's still nicely contained here that we are focusing on the end user, and then the second part of the paper, or second of three parts of the paper, then goes into the behind the scenes or more nuts and bolts. But okay, so that's a good point. Then let me pop over to that main section, that first section. So up front, we basically define serverless computing, and we do a bit of the positioning versus IaaS, containers as a service, and PaaS. Sarah had added a comment here which basically captures the idea of backend as a service, which was kind of this little elephant in the room that we had been avoiding before because we were focusing on the developer creating applications themselves within this context. But basically, I've added 2 paragraphs. There was one about this idea of the association between functions as a service and serverless, and that backend as a service comment to address Sarah's comment. Okay. And then someone had created this section. I don't see what the provenance of it was, but this was pretty nice because this now positions it as well with platforms of service. At a high level, we get into the details in the second section of the paper. Okay. The history of serverless was here. I think, Doug, you added this. This is almost like an aside in many ways, but it's here. I don't think there's any different or better place to put it, but maybe it does address some of the controversy of the name and explain why it came to be.
Yeah, to be clear, I actually just filled it out. I didn't actually add it, but if people want to move it around or even delete it, I'm okay with that.
Okay. Okay, and then that change that I mentioned, this was the workloads. Was formerly Appendix 2. It was its own standalone document before we merged everything. So it seemed to fit much better here. And right, so this basically talks to you, okay, these are some workloads that are theoretical approaches here that are now can be addressed by cloud computing with serverless, and where they've shown improvements, ideally in a measurable way, over those existing deployment models. There was a few comments on performance. Perhaps this should be dug into a little deeper, maybe in an appendix, but just made some vague. They kind of addressed it in a vague way that there's a startup cost that might happen here, be it on a container-based system or something where you don't know what's running the functions behind the scenes.
Yeah, although I think the question is if the definition of serverless is that it has to go to 0 in number of instances. We know that many implementations don't do that, or even load it and keep it for 5 minutes, etc. So I don't know if serverless by definition means that it have to evaporate.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key points, right? I think that came up in the PaaS versus serverless up here. Was that here we go, second bullet. One of the key points here is that PaaS always has 1 instance versus serverless is 0 for a good portion of the time.
I don't know if that's a real definition of serverless, because for some applications, or even with serverless, if you're working on a stream processing, there's always something in the stream, or at least once every 5 minutes, it will always be up. We've seen articles in the web how you sort of hack AWS Lambda with those tricks.
Yeah, so maybe it should be softened to that. It can do that. Well, with PaaS, you're right. I know with Cloud Foundry, stop it and start it.
Yeah, I think can is the right word.
Yeah, we can work on that. That's a minor change. But so Dan, as you walk through these various workloads, did you add text to explain why serverless is either the only fit for that particular workload, or why it's a better fit for that workload? Because I think there have been lots of comments in there talking about, well, why is this new for serverless? I could do this using other technology. So why are you bringing this up as a serverless benefit when I could do it on IaaS, for example, right?
Right. And then that brings me to this paragraph here, right? So when I originally created this section, this little piece was almost like speaker notes. And the goal of this section was to frame serverless, the examples below the use cases, as having done something in some magnitude order better than an existing model. So be that performance, cost, something there. So this may not stay as is as text, but that's the spirit of what follows. And that was why, it's supposed to encourage the reader to think, hey, listen, if I can do something 10 times better, faster, or deliver it 10 times faster, these are some of the areas that I would consider it.
Would it be possible to elaborate a little on there? Because to simply say serverless is faster is kind of a vague statement. It'd be nice to be able to say in what ways it's faster, because as a newbie, if I looked at this, I'd look at it and say, okay, why is serverless inherently faster? Once the application or the function is up and running, it should be able to process things at the exact same speed as whether it's running on an IaaS. So it's because to me, functions as service versus IaaS is more about the infrastructure in which you're hosting it, but not necessarily the application running itself. Except when you're talking about auto scaling and stuff like that. But even then, it's similar enough. So, what is it about serverless that makes things faster and better?
Exactly right. So yeah, I think that the historical aspect of this section was that it was two parts. Number one was describing the general use case, and then number two was to include an example with those dimensions of difference. Those were always kind of a gap in the paper, and I know I never had the time to fill those out. But that's kind of where this example section of each was supposed to get to, right? You say, for example, in the Santander use case, by handling 1 billion checks with $32,000, this is X degrees more efficient than their existing system. Things like that. So that's where I think it would benefit the paper to add those numbers, right? So if I edit this.
Yeah, I think that'd be good. I think definitely a step in the right direction. So that's good.
I think those examples do help, and they concrete in some of the speaker notes, if you will, above. Some of the speaker notes are, depending upon put others whose worldview isn't within serverless, but maybe on PaaS or CAS or something else, it puts them on the defense. And in fact, they're not always true. I mean, it just depends on the use case, and that's why the examples are good. That in fact, it may cost more to run these things as a function, or the performance may not be as good because the function wasn't warm, or I get anyway, there's some nuances there or there's some caveats that we might want to toss in that I think are exposed through the examples where, in fact, those statements are true, just not in all cases.
Good. Okay. I just added that as a comment here. Okay. Okay. The other thing I did was I updated some of the examples, right? I kind of made the wording a little bit simpler, where you basically have one general concept in the main paragraph and then kind of some alternate examples. It's not perfect, but I hope I addressed some of the comments that were in there. And also, for example, this bullet was moved down from the top part of the section to be something more specific to IoT instead of us repeating the IoT bullet. Yeah, I think there was still a to do here for Antonio to talk more about stream processing. And as well, the same example with chatbots. So something where perhaps some third-party developer created some chatbot that suddenly plugged into Facebook and became incredibly popular, right? Overwhelming what normally would have been some pretty static back-end infrastructure to support it, and instead was able to scale up to the millions or billions of requests needed. So each of these use cases here, again, targeting the end user, talking to some of their current pain points, and then working from there. So so for each of these sections, it would be helpful if people could come forward with specific examples with those numbers, those dimensions of goodness that I'd called it. Okay, and I had noticed, when we had done the merge of the paper, each of the sections kind of had an explicit summary that should probably end up more at the conclusion of the paper. This is one of them as well. And below here was the strikeout of that container focus of the paper that was a bit controversial. So I crossed it out. There may be parts here to salvage for other parts of the paper, such as the bit about 12-factor applications. I know that's a hot topic for Chris Munns. It's also one of my favorite talking points for developers. With a serverless architecture, you can get halfway to 12 factors by doing nothing because the platform does that for you in terms of scaling and operations. I think that's a good point that we should probably bring in somewhere else. But for now, it's crossed out here. And as we move into the second major section, I did try to soften the wording around containers because the assumption in the earlier section was that, okay, here are the other cloud native application deployment platforms. They are all based on containers, but they approach the developer experience differently. If we're going to soften that, again, there's probably some more wording updates here. I put a bit of a disclaimer in, right? So they tend to focus on containers, and I'm sure many of the public cloud providers do use containers behind the scenes, but may not necessarily be a requirement. And there were a few other comments in line that I think I addressed. Distributed systems, instead container interaction. Platform as a service, yeah, there was a good comment here from Justin. I think there's some places to make that clearer or interact with the earlier section of the document where we do the explicit comparison to platform as a service.
I think there was another point that it's not necessarily either or, that serverless can run on top of containers or on top of PaaS or be part of PaaS.
Yeah. Yes, correct. And maybe that's something that can go into this disclaimer as well. Okay. Good. Okay. And yeah, the rest of these, I believe, were just comments in line. Peter had a few comments here that were more around, right? I think getting to the point that this isn't a magic bullet. There's a lot of benefits here. The developer has shifted away from operations, but they still have to be aware that there's servers behind the scenes, of course. So there's some things that still bleed out of that abstraction, including perhaps like processor types. I know there was some talk about that recently. You still kind of have to be aware of some of the magic that's going on behind the scenes. So it's less about a complete shift, but moving up the spectrum. Same here.
Dan, is this new text or is this just existing text?
This is all existing text except for the specific comments, right? So I slightly reworded things to address the comments, but I didn't close out the comments.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And I think that's basically the rest of the section. Again, with the summary, should go to probably a back-end chapter. Okay. So that covers my changes. I know that there was also an open change that maybe we'll get to later in this call about this whole spec chapter. I know the guys from Serverless, the company, were interested in maybe abstracting that out. But any other comments on upfront about talking to the use cases, the developer, and then working into that second section?
Hey, Dan, this is Austin Collins here from Serverless Inc. I think overall this looks pretty good. A lot of the changes represent a improvement, softening the language around containers. I think it's definitely the right move. The serverless framework, we get a lot of people coming from that community, but we get a vast amount of people not coming from that community. So I'm in support of that decision. The context in the beginning, referencing how BAS fits into this or PaaS and stuff, I think is great, because that's usually some of the first questions we get, like how does this compare to all these other things that are kind of perceived as serverless. Some of the use cases, I know we have a ton of cost savings examples that we could fill in. So I'm going to ask our team to pull up some of those, and maybe we could add those into the docs, into this doc. Also, I think Pete's comments on not a magic bullet. This is something I think is really important for anyone evangelizing serverless. Is that if you evangelize it the wrong way, it does alienate could alienate the sysadmin community a bit. And in the early days when we were all super excited about this, I think we went a little too far in that direction, and there was a bit of backlash. So, and this is why I really appreciate what Pete's trying to say there. And I think this is important because if we want to work with those people, and that job is certainly not going away, it might change a little bit. I think the best approach here is just to figure out how to kind of bring them into this tent and be open to them. So,
can you explain why they felt alienated?
Because in the early days, we were using the term no ops a lot, which I think was even worse. I think it was kind of maybe somewhat threatening, and a lot of it was somewhat untrue. There's definitely always going to be operations administration, but I think these things are just going to change. And I think everybody went too strong on the buzzword hype there. So I'd recommend just being a little bit more sensitive about that in the future, because it does result in a lot of backlash if you're not careful.
Yeah, I've been developing a lot of conjectures around, on-prem serverless, and one of them is around this actually gives control and governance back to IT ops. If they offer a functions as a service, they now have visibility into the workloads that are being run within functions as a service.
Highlighting points like that in here, I think would be great.
Yeah, so up front, there's a history of the phrase serverless. I think it would be good to add that no ops bit in here somewhere.
Is that something that you can do, Dan, or Austin, or is that something you'd like to take?
We've actually backed off the no ops term lately, so we haven't. We don't really use it as much. Perhaps you could put it in here, maybe kind of just just talking about it instead of kind of using that term might be helpful. I'm not quite sure how to fit it in at the moment.
Yeah. I think I think the value would be is at least saying, hey, listen, you might have heard this term just like you hear these other terms in this context.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer the politically correct term or whatever,
Sure.
Well, I'm just wondering if introducing it would just cause too much hassle.
I can agree the way on that one. I can see someone wondering about this other term they've heard about and how it relates to this, because we don't want them thinking it's a completely separate piece of technology. But then introducing it may add to the confusion that you're talking about, Mark. It's a toss-up.
Yeah.
I think we have enough problems with serverless and fast that introducing it is not a route I would really want to go down.
Yeah. Would it be better then to maybe not completely ignore it and just stick it into like the terminology section or just in the glossary type section, but not actually call it out in the body of the document?
I'd be fine with that.
On a related note, I did update the definition of functions as service back here. We had it as like, hey, listen, for the reference of this, for the purpose of this paper, we defined FAS as the same thing as serverless, but I kind of expanded it to say, yes, there's this concept of the core functionality, running functions versus a managed system that's providing additional quality of service and offloading the management of the service. So maybe I'll just put a no ops placeholder in here. It doesn't look like we're in alphabetical order, that is it.
Thanks, Dan.
Looking over the section around workloads that are good fit for serverless, brings to mind, should we expand out what makes sense or why you would want on-prem serverless as opposed to public cloud serverless? Some of those use cases or needs?
Yeah, that's a good point. Where did you think that one would fit in? Maybe the Is that kind of an implementation bit in the serverless versus others?
To be honest, I'm broaching the subject, but I don't know a good place.
Now, we do have the section on workloads that are a good fit for serverless. It might be just after that where it's sort of parlaying off of that, saying, what workloads are good for public.
Got it. Yeah. Okay.
So just out of curiosity, Mark, what kind of stuff were you thinking of mentioning in there? Because it seems like some of those decisions might be the same type of decisions to justify why do IaaS and public versus private, right?
Yeah, I'd say that there's when I've been talking with people, there's been a lot of questioning. Why would I run it on-prem because it's not truly serverless, right? And so just talking through some of the use cases, you could say there may be reasons to run it on-prem for compliance, privacy, security, or even low latency delivery of the same types of functions. Not to mention, you want to have portability of cloud native architectures, and serverless is a cloud native design pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, but I would still call things like Amazon Snowball Edge, which run Lambda, sort of still serverless compared to someone installing a FAS stack.
Yeah.
So I think there are actually three types here. One is sort of a public cloud, sort of pre-integrated as a service, serverless. There's the same thing that extends to the cloud still managed through the cloud, but may have extensions in sort of on the ship. And the third is DIY, which it's actually also can be in public cloud or on-prem. So you have two dimensions here. Sort of DIY versus pre-integrated, and the other one is local versus public.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not talking the implementations there. I'm talking more some of the use cases as to why you would want potentially your own DIY on-prem.
Right, and I know that there's a bunch of use cases in here, right? So this comes up quite a bit with OpenWhisk naturally, right? That is one of its selling points. I've got a few points I can add in this little section here, and then maybe we can discuss it for next week. But yeah, there's right, and I know the controversy here is it's not serverless if you're running it yourself, right? Which is clear, but what that's missing is that to the developer it doesn't matter. That's their point of view, whether it's on a public cloud or another team they may know of that's running it for them, right? So I think that's a fair point of controversy, and maybe we can refer to it somehow. I don't know why, but I can put in a little placeholder for that.
Okay.
Right, but also how you wrote it right now, it's sort of serverless versus FAS. I don't see that serverless versus FAS, because serverless could also be in the edge. So we need to understand what are we focusing on the fact that it's FAS or it's sort of do it yourself, or the fact that it's close to the edge because of latency or other reasons.
Right. Yep. Good point. Okay. 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 Doug, I know another big point I think on the agenda was around this idea of the implementation section. I know this had always been a little bit touchy for us because so this is the third major section. Talking about not being prescriptive about much of the model message format. I mean, maybe this is an area for the CNCF to talk about interoperability. but I don't know where we left it with this idea of specific implementations and details.
I don't think that this section is a specification, because what it does is reflects the existing implementations and even highlights, give points from multiple implementations. So we're not here to point a spec, but I think we have to have it beyond sort of positioning and use cases, a way for the next to pave the way for the next step, which is eventually my view that what we're doing here is not just all sitting around and saying serverless is great, is also trying to get to some consensus around how you use it, how you drive events into it, etc. And if we don't have anything technical, we're just serving the fluff and the positioning and opinions, we would never drive to the next level.
Fair point. Yeah. So I think then the wording up front here, because we say spec right in the title, of common features or something like that. I mean,
it's more of an overview of the function of serverless functionality or model.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to wonder is, and forgive me if I'm just not remembering correctly, but I don't remember in the last call there was a lot of concern that this was too implementation specific. Did I just miss that part of the conversation? Because my reading of it was that it was fairly high level and didn't get into too many implementation specific details.
Yeah, we actually added more, based on the comments. We added references to Google, to Azure, to AWS, just so to OpenWhisk, just to make sure that we're not falling into that trap.
Right.
Okay, then I'm happy with it. Yeah, I think that's good. I think I was getting hung up then on the title of the section, which says spec right there. So.
Yeah, I think we've gone about that, or we've talked about that several times now. I think we do need to change the title, because the word spec in there is just going to blow people's minds, and that's not what we meant to do. We got to find a better phrase for it.
By the way, how do you call CNI and CSI?
I think I thought that those were actually specifications, because I thought they actually defined APIs.
Yeah, it's a bit, so this is Lee. Having spent a lot of time with on CNI and also just CNM from Docker. Yeah, we generally didn't use the term CNI. I'm sorry, the term spec. By and large, the CNCF, and Chris can chime in if he's listening, doesn't necessarily set about to producing industry standards. I guess in so much as you consider an industry standard measured by the way in which it's, or how broadly it's adopted, then you might. But anyway, we shied away there as well. Framework and.
Well, I think there is a difference, though, right? I mean, between spec and standard. I definitely agree that CNCF is not in the position of defining standards, or at least not yet. But I always use the term specification sort of interchangeably with just an API doc.
Mm-hmm. We ended up, yeah, you're right. That's a fair fair delineation. Framework and model were commonly used terms. But just throughout that process, we didn't. We didn't. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't a topic of conversation that really. It wasn't a point of sensitivity. So we just didn't iterate on it.
Right. Okay.
I mean, so we may well have used the term specification just casually, nonchalantly, without folks throwing up their arms when we did.
Right. Okay. So in terms of next steps here, I know since I don't think Chris Munns is on the call, so we can't ask him for his status. I'm wondering, well, actually, before I get to that, so let me ask a very sort of directed question. Dan, you were looking at Appendix B a second ago. Talking about the, that's it, serverless implementations. I can't remember who owned this section. Mark, it may have been you and Lee. I can't remember for sure. I'm just wondering, what's your guys' status on filling out these things? Because last time I looked through here, it looked like there was still some text missing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had started that section, and the intent had been for some of the open source teams to be able to be able to fill it out more fully about their projects. In terms of the services section, I don't know how. I think it makes sense to mention services, but that landscape is moving so quickly that I don't know that I could do it justice with respect to all the services, except to say, you know, here's the CNCF landscape doc that shows all of these services that everyone's providing.
So let me ask a potentially controversial question. What do you think about actually dropping the open source services section? Mainly because it seems to me that that's getting into almost a different topic, in the sense that it's talking about sort of the services that these functions may actually use. And while we acknowledge that those functions, I'm sorry, those services exist at other places in the paper, I'm wondering what is the value of actually mentioning the exact list of services that are out there.
My original intent was to drive the conversation around, we need common eventing, we need to have interoperability of the services with all of the functions as a service open source projects. You know, being able to drive the entire ecosystem around serverless that isn't just the functions but also the services. So that was the intent. I can be talked into removing this section, but I think that we still need to leave readers of this document with the thought that it is more than just running a, you know, how do I run a function? I need to look at the entire ecosystem.
So that kind of raises an interesting question to me then, because when we've talked about interoperability around this space, I think for sure everybody would agree that we talked about if there was any place for interoperability, it's at least at the topmost layer in my mind anyway, the way I picture it. Meaning, you know, how do the functions get invoked? Is there a common API format or something like that, right? And you're kind of talking about on the lower level, interoperability from the function itself out to the services. And I kind of view that problem as not serverless specific, meaning whether I'm using a Docker container, Kubernetes pod, Cloud Foundry application, or anything else, as an application developer, sure, I would love to have interoperability across, say, eventing or monitoring or something like that, so that when I go to invoke these other services, I can plug in different ones without having to, you know, cause much pain. But because it's not serverless specific, I'm inclined to say that's not necessarily a space we have to focus on as part of this paper.
No, I agree with Mark. I think it's a very key thing, because the serverless is a sort of an event-driven function, and your function is getting called with an event context. So if you're just building your own IaaS application, you're not forced to use events or a certain model. No one tries to create sort of interoperability. Also, I had an interesting discussion yesterday with Corey Sanders from Azure. You know, they have their event hub. And there are a few efforts in the industry around those. Most of those are around HTTP, you know, invocation, pretty slow, pretty synchronous, and maybe we need to have something like that, which is more generalized. You know, we were thinking maybe to come with a straw man proposal, because I think, you know, just take even just the open source solutions that are running on top of Kubernetes, like Nucleo and Fison and Kubeles, and they all use the Ingress, Nginx Ingress, which is lacking many features. So if instead of any one of us, you know, going and beefing up or creating custom, add-ons, if we all agree on this is how an event source, whether it's an HTTP thing or something that drives an asynchronous pub/sub message, or maybe a streaming to Kafka, if we have sort of some sort of a schema. I think it's, by the way, even good for Amazon, because if you go and look at the different events in Lambda triggered by the different event sources, there's no schema. There's no way for you as a user to know how to use those without reading the full details.
So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I could also see where we could use this as a way to drive what are the next steps would be understanding what is the landscape around services and some level of common eventing. We've been struggling with what are the next steps, and perhaps that's the perfect way to frame it.
Yeah, so maybe let's work together, some of us, to come with a proposal on what do we see as a potential common eventing model. I heard also the serverless.com guys talking about something like that, and I think it's a big necessity because we want to drive all sorts of events, and I don't want to start implementing plugins to any source of data that exists.
Okay. So is this something, Mark, that you, Yaron, and Lee can sort of flesh out in that section?
Yes.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, cool. And now, Mark, you mentioned that at the beginning of that section, you were hoping that the open source folks themselves would sort of fill out those sections. I'm wondering whether it makes sense for us not to wait for them to do it and us take an initial straw man proposal, just so we have some text there and it's as complete as we can do. And if they don't like it, then they can go ahead and edit it.
Maybe we don't need to be specific and just put a couple of paragraphs saying that serverless have to connect to XYZ, and we encourage having something like a common model or something.
Well,
one of those.
I think Doug was talking about the actual functions as a service, serverless implementations, not the services. Correct.
Correct. I was talking about the first part of Appendix B, where you actually list out Google Cloud Functions, Lambda, OpenWhisk, stuff like that.
Yeah. I think that doing it justice, I'd like to hear from the projects, but in lieu of that, we can fill it. I'll spend some time to flesh that out.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I just get nervous waiting on
I made one comment that this micro cool is not really a serverless, sort of a CGI invoke.
Just out of curiosity, where is that? Oh, that. Yeah. See, I think you're in the next section.
Is this the right section in microcule that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's what he's talking about, and I was referring to the previous section.
Okay.
I think. Although it is kind of interesting because wait a minute, you have.
Yeah, there's public cloud and then there's open source /
I'm sorry, you're right. I was mixing up two sections, not someone else. Sorry. Right, open source serverless versus open source services. I was mixing up those two sections. Titles are very close.
Yeah. By the way, OpenWhisk and also Azure and us, I think also Google have both options. So we sort of double dip on both sections. So maybe we don't need to separate it.
Okay. Sorry.
I'd say that I was arbitrary with respect to saying what was public cloud and what was open source, and I'm fine with us combining that.
Okay. So the public and the open here?
Maybe we need to come with a table so it's more uniform.
It's funny. I was just thinking about that, Yaron. So you know what? The CNCF has this little cloud native landscape document. This isn't the latest version.
Don't remind me that one.
Actually, the latest version of this has gotten better. But see this github.com/
the one that puts Hadoop in the database, or
I'm waiting for the 3D version that's coming.
Yeah. So in theory, we could be kind of like a little oh, there it is. Yeah, a little prettier. But if we had something similar, possibly for the serverless landscape, right? So something similar to this.
By the way, Chris, while we're looking at it, the database and data warehouse, just change it to data and data analytics, because you have there all the big data stuff as databases.
Yeah, I know. It's hard to please. And we have serverless / event-based stuff all lumped in.
Oh, yeah.
So that's not complete by any means either. We are working on a live kind of version where you'll essentially just have a JSON file with all these things there, and then kind of a web page, a fancy web UI based on that data.
Hey, Chris, this is Austin here. Seems like you have a ton on your plate, but is there any way we could switch out our logo in that? And if so, who do we talk to?
Yeah, just give me an email, and I'll take care of it.
Awesome, thanks.
Isn't that in a GitHub, and you could probably do a PR?
You can't do a PR right now. There's no source format. So you can open up an issue.
There we go.
Live.
Yeah, sorry. I'll kill off.
Awesome, thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, guys.
All right. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. It sounds to me, in terms of the next steps, Dan, you have a fair amount of things that you sort of volunteer for to sort of finish out. Mark, Lee, and Yaron, you guys were going to look at that the Appendix B type section. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that there's still quite a few comments in the doc. In fact, people keep adding comments. If for the sections that you guys own, please do your best to try to resolve those. And if you are on the call and you are adding comments to the doc, I would really, really prefer, rather than you just adding comments saying, please talk about this, actually mark up the document with your suggested text. That makes it so much easier for someone to see what you're exactly thinking of. And that way, if they like it, they hit approve. Saying and abstractly talk about this isn't going to get resolved nearly as quickly. And I think we all want to sort of try to finish this thing out sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Anything else people want to talk about? I know we still have to really sit down and talk about the conclusion and recommend the next steps, but I feel like we got to get the body of the text in there first. And we are slowly adding more stuff to the conclusion section. We just need to spend time on one of these calls fleshing it out. But I'd rather hold off on that first and get the body there. So any other topics, questions, comments?
Yes, hi, this is Austin here. Have a quick question for everyone. I think that's using this document to set the stage for a standardization effort is a fantastic goal. Standardization is something we've been focused on for a long time at the serverless framework, given that we seek to provide this uniform experience across all the serverless compute providers. We have about 9 different serverless compute vendors integrated into the framework right now, from large cloud providers to smaller vendors. A lot of them have written and maintained those integrations themselves. And we want to make that experience better. It needs to be. Of course, everyone went at this with their own opinions, and it's just created a lot of usability and onboarding issues. So that said, we're still a bit new to the CNCF and trying to get to know everyone here. But what is the status of this standardization effort, and who here is interested in that?
So speaking,
I think we're all interested, but no one dares say the word standard.
Yeah, I was going to find a nicer way to put it, but yeah, I think everybody would like, quote, harmonization, and that's why we may recommend certain efforts heading down that path of quote harmonization. But everybody's afraid of using the standards word because it's like the third rail of this work right now. Even though people are doing it with CSI, CNI. Yeah. So at this point in time, I think it's best if we focus less on looking for quote standardization and just finding areas where we can work on interoperability or harmonization. And so if you have specific areas where you think we should do that, then add that to the conclusion section of the doc. For example, eventing keeps coming up a lot, right? Is there something we can do in that space? Can we get some agreement on what the context object looks like for these things? So, things like that, if you can rattle those off and stick that in the conclusion section to get the ball rolling on those discussions, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, Austin, take, for example, in serverless.com, you have those YAMLs that try to abstract things away. So, just try and see from what we wrote in the implementation section here, how does it align? There are things that sort of bothers me with your model, for example, lack of versioning and things like that, but maybe we can get to a consensus of what would be the right model. And AWS presented SAML, a couple of weeks ago.
Or Sam, yeah. From the CNCF perspective, eventually we would expect an output from the group that hopefully would consist of a project or set of projects that would help kind of do some harmonization in this space, whether it's seeded from work from an existing company that's modified to be more inclusive of their technology, or just something new from scratch. I think it's kind of up to this group to decide. Essentially, the TOC is relying on this group to come up with a set of recommendations and even potentially candidate projects to focus on.
Does that help, Austin?
Yes, very good recap of everything that's going on.
I think the two critical things we can work on, continuing with Chris' thing, is one is the event model. The other one is those YAML, just like what serverless has, which allows you to define the function. I think beyond that, the other things are neat. But if we have a common event model and we have a simple way to describe a function and its dependency, I think we're in a good shape.
Yes, I totally agree. So how much are we going to put in this white paper? It sounds like we're just kind of highlighting these areas where we'd like to harmonize. But well, here's where we're at as a company. We've been working with a lot of these providers on this for a little while, and we've got a few things down, from event schemas to function models, down at pretty low level kind of specification suggestions. And I don't think the white paper is going to be the right place to put in all those low level details. I think the goal of just kind of outlining the major areas and talking about them at kind of a high level is the right approach for the white paper. Is there a separate place where we could go get into the low level details? Because we've made a lot of progress here and would love to just start getting into this stuff with everybody here in the CNCF.
Yeah, you could create a GitHub repo, call it whatever you want, common serverless event model or something, and kind of collaborate that way. That seems to be a common effort that's happened with other initiatives like CSI and CNI and so on. But it's really up for this group to decide. I could just kind of give you examples of what has worked for other CNCF projects.
Yeah, that's true. Isn't now I can't remember the name of the startup, but Austin. They were here in Austin at the Serverless Conf, and one of the announcements they had was, I thought it was a specification. I don't remember.
I think standard lib introduced Fastlane.
Yeah, that's one.
Which I think was a bit different than what some of the topics that I'm hearing here, which I think we're more interested in, like event schemas. I believe that they were, I believe they weren't specifically focused on that.
Okay.
Yeah, Austin, I'll try and reach out to you to talk about those, because we've also done some work and we've reviewed your models and have some feedback on that.
Fantastic. That sounds great. I just joined the CNCF Slack channel, so would love to chat with all the people interested in this. On our end, we're also working with some providers who are interested in moving pretty quickly on this, because there's just a lot of innovations coming out in this space, and they all have tight deadlines. So it'd be better if we could do this all together and come out with something that works for everyone, of course. So looking forward to carrying this conversation into Slack, and we'll figure out what to do from there.
Can you also comment on those sections in the document? Because we did try to, at least in a high level, describe what are the types of events, what type of information was carried by events, etc. So if you have comments on that, it's good to get your feedback.
Yes, I've scanned it. It looks very close to our thinking. Looks very close to a lot of the serverless frameworks thinking, and we'll continue to dig into it. I think our team has made a few comments, but I'll ask them to give it another take.
All right, cool. Thank you. All right, and I think that takes us to the top of the hour. So we do have a phone call again next week. I know it's actually during the Linux Summit, or I'm sorry, the Open Source Summit in Los Angeles. Do people still want to have the call next week or not? Any preference?
This is Lee. I can, but
Okay. I was gonna keep it on the schedule unless I hear people saying that they absolutely can't make it. So.
I may or may not be able to make it due to we have a VMworld in Barcelona.
Ah. Okay. Well, I'm not hearing a huge list of people saying they can't make it. So let's keep it on the schedule for right now. If you can't make it, please let me know. And if we get enough people saying they can't, then we'll reconsider. But as of right now, we'll keep it on for next week. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll talk to you later. Or
Thanks.
next time.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.